They say money is printed by governments, but that is not entirely true. Governments print currency. Real money, real power, is printed in the shadows behind velvet drapes, inside the echoing halls of private banks, where voices are low and ledgers speak louder than constitutions. I have watched centuries pass like a slow-burning ledger, and in that time, one name has never faded: Rothschild. Picture Frankfurt in the late 18th century, not the dazzling banks or glass towers you know today. No, this was a city of candles, smoke, and debt, where gold changed hands in whispers, and the true power resided not in thrones, but in counting houses. Their empire was built not on coins or castles, but on debt. Yours, mine, nations, because he who holds the debt holds the future. And debt, my friend, never sleeps. Systems, however, banking systems, so live empire. And so, he devised something most men could not even imagine: a network. Wars could not start without their blessing. Peace could not be negotiated without their approval, because they understood what even the gods of history forget. True power is not in the hand, it's in the silence behind the hand. And yet, they held no political office. They swore allegiance to no crown. Their power was not visible. It was structural, a web, not a throne. And webs do not break when you cut at the surface. They flex, they tighten, they pull you in. 5 sons, trained like generals, sent across Europe like a living nervous system. One in London, one in Paris, one in Naples, one in Vienna, one in Frankfurt. Each operating a node of a financial empire that needed no flag, no border, no army. They didn't conquer, they financed the conquerors. And inside one such house, in the Judengasse ghetto, lived a man named Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He was not born powerful. He was not born free. And when the British government needed funds to continue the war, it was Nathan Rothschild, Mayer's son in London, who provided it. That he manipulated the stock market with nothing but the gravity of silence and the timing of a well-placed rider. Perhaps it's true, perhaps not. But what matters is this: he created a myth so powerful that it became truth. And in finance, perception is the god that eats reality, not through speeches or patriotism, but through a tactic far more powerful: a silent bond market maneuver that made him richer in one afternoon than most empires managed in a century. But he was born with the one instinct that separates the rich from the rulers: the ability to see that money is not about wealth. It's about timing, secrecy, and control. He began humbly, dealing in rare coins and lending to nobles, but he learned quickly that coins tarnish and kings die. When Napoleon marched across Europe, it was not muskets that halted him, it was liquidity. They whisper that he knew the outcome of Waterloo before the government did, but do not mistake this for greed. The Rothschilds were never gamblers. They were engineers. They did not play the game. They helped design it. By the mid-19th century, they were lending to governments, central banks, kings. I've seen dynasties fall. I've seen nations dissolve. But the Rothschilds, they adapted, because they understood what even the gods of history forget. True power is not in the hand. It's in the silence behind the hand. Empires rose and fell like tides, but the Rothschilds remained, not because they stood against history, but because they flowed beneath it. While kings carved borders with blood, the Rothschilds drew invisible lines across ledgers and treaties. That was only the beginning. When the smoke cleared, they were already planting deeper roots: government loans in Britain, railways in France, mining in Austria, oil in Baku. If there was a lever that moved a nation, they bought it. Not to own the nation, no. That would have been too obvious. They simply owned the conditions of its survival. They had no flags, but they financed them all. They paid their taxes, bled in wars, lived and died unaware that their lives were being mortgaged to a dynasty they could not name. A machine that saw nations not as sacred lands, but as assets and liabilities. A machine that could wait decades for repayment. Because time, after all, is the true currency of dynasties. They were simply not looking for permission to exist. They had already made themselves a law beyond law, a power behind power. This was the genius. The Rothschilds made themselves invisible not through secrecy, but through complexity. Their world was a maze of holding companies, agents, intermediaries, and trust so tangled that even if you found the end of one thread, it led only to another door, another shadow. And in this delicate balance of alliances, fear, and fortune, they became the quiet arbiters of Europe's fate. It was not just the war against Napoleon. They had positioned themselves at the bottleneck of capital itself. No canal was dug, no railroad laid, no revolution funded without some sliver of their approval, their funding, their hidden calculation. Nathan Rothschild didn't teach us fund wars. He helped create the very instruments by which modern finance would enslave entire populations. He helped shape the bond market as we know it. National debt was no longer a crisis. It was a commodity, something to be packaged, traded, expanded. With every loan came interest. With every interest payment, the strings pulled tighter. They invented a way of operating that became the blueprint for all elite families who came after. No gold vaults open to plunder, no armies to rebel against. They lent to monarchies and democracies, revolutionaries and conservatives alike. Theirs was a religion of balance sheets and time horizons, not flags or anthems. And in doing so, they became the secret continuity behind history's chaos. When others took sides, they took stakes. Only contracts, bonds, silent flows of capital through 1,000 Their influence could not be assassinated or overthrown. It had no face, only form. It was systemic, institutional, patient. But what truly set them apart was this: they never bet on ideology. London, in particular, became the jewel of their crownless empire. And what of the people? Did they know? No, they saw only parliaments and kings. The family motto was Concordia, Integritas, Industria, Harmony, Integrity. But behind that Latin grace lay a machine. By the time other families realized what the Rothschilds had done, it was too late. They hadn't just gotten rich, and yet they remained polite, dignified, silent. The world called them a mystery, but they were no mystery. And while the world danced with democracy and dreamed of freedom, the Rothschilds merely adjusted interest rates. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had begun to forget. New names had risen: Rockefeller, Morgan Carnegie, industrial empires with smokestacks and steel. And in its wake, governments borrowed more than ever. Regulation, centralization, the slow suffocation of private empires. And yet, somehow, the Rothschilds remained. They stepped back from headlines, but not from influence. They embedded themselves deeper, not in politics, but in the structures beneath politics, to become indistinguishable from the very concept of international capital itself. Conspiracy theorists shouted of world domination, secret meetings, bloodlines, but the truth was both simpler and more terrifying. The Rothschilds no longer needed to rule. They had already written the rules. The system that prints money, sets interest, shifts, governs it bore their intellectual fingerprint. You could dismantle every bank that bore their name, and still their ghost would whisper in the vaults of the IMF, the World Bank, the EC, where once 5 brothers formed the nervous system of an empire. Now thousands of subsidiaries, shell companies, and financial instruments operated like ghost limbs of a forgotten body. They advised, they merged, they seeded, they disappeared into the bloodstream of global finance. Who would lend to the shattered remains of Europe? Who but the old, patient house that had weathered empires? Just algorithms. And yet, behind some of those algorithms, the logic of debt, of leverage, of long-term dominance still echoed. The lessons taught in that cramped ghetto counting house 2 centuries ago. The Rothschilds didn't fight in trenches. They financed the reconstruction. They lent not just money, but stability. Because by then, they had become something more than bankers. They were custodians of continuity. They were loud, American, hungry. The Rothschilds, by contrast, seemed to fade like old oil on canvas. Newspapers no longer whispered their name with fear. Their portraits hung in museums. Their mansions became institutions. But let me tell you what the world misunderstood. Fading from sight is not fading from power. It is even. The First World War shattered monarchies, redrew maps, and buried millions. But the world was changing. National banks were rising. In the shadows of post-war treaties, they brokered debt deals, war reparations, resource rights. Where others saw ruins, they saw and still, they took no thrones, no speeches, only signatures. But then came 1945, the end of another world war. And this time, America emerged dominant. The dollar became king. Bretton Woods created a new world order. And the Rothschilds, they adapted again. They moved into oil, into infrastructure, into the machinery of globalization. They weren't the architects of the new system, but they were its original cartographers. The old network of family banks began to dissolve. London, Paris, Vienna, some shuttered, some absorbed, and yet the family name lingered, quietly repositioned through trusts, partnerships, and holdings. You see, this was the next stage, not to dominate the market, but to disappear into it. And all the while, rumors bloomed like mold in dark corners of the internet. And as digital banking rose, as paper faded into code, their stories slipped further from memory. No more coin portraits, no more grand halls. They didn't need to be seen anymore. They had become architecture. Look around you. The headlines no longer mention them. The forums argue over other names: BlackRock, Vanguard, trillion-dollar asset managers that sound like science fiction syndicates. The Rothschilds, they are dismissed as relics, shadows of an old Europe. Every citizen, every government, every bank is entangled in the web. Your home is mortgaged on principles designed by men in wigs and candlelight. Your taxes pay interest on debts structured in centuries-old templates. Your economic future is forecast by models built atop ledgers first opened in Frankfurt. Their wealth is no longer a question of numbers, it is a question of access. It does not wear a crown or ride a horse into battle. It rides the yield curve. It waits in the basement of every central bank. Debt is not temporary, and the ones who first mastered this no longer need to be seen at all. It is the ghost in every algorithm that determines your mortgage rate, your pension fund, your cost of bread. Access to knowledge, to policy, to momentum. They no longer seek control. They are the conditions of control. But that is the final brilliance of their empire. When the architecture is complete, the architect vanishes. But the truth is quieter. The truth is this: they no longer need to print money, because they help design the system that prints it for them. And so, the Rothschilds did not fall. They fulfilled the last requirement of true power: becoming invisible. Because this story was never about one family. It was about a formula. It was confidence specifically. Confidence in debt. Convincing the world that iOS could become currency, that credit could replace coin, that perpetual interest could replace temporary kings. That is the foundation of our world now. We do not live in democracies or monarchies. We live in debtocracies ruled not by ballots or bloodlines, but by balance sheets. A system of control so subtle, so elegant, that it does not require enforcement, only inertia. Central banking, interest-bearing debt, intergovernmental loans, inflation targeting, quantitative easing, these are not modern ideas. They are the matured fruits of seeds planted centuries ago. The Rothschilds were merely the first gardeners, and now the harvest is global. And yet, most people will never know. They'll hear the name Rothschild and think only of antiques, of dusty libraries, of conspiracies too absurd to fear. If a country needs war, it prints money. If a market collapses, it prints money. If a pandemic strikes, it prints money. And who holds the bonds that absorb this printing? Who profits as debt expands and currencies dilute? Not always a Rothschild by name, but often by structure, often by design. Their true invention was not gold, not even banking, and yet they remained quiet. The last surviving family banks still operate, discreetly managing wealth, advising elites, underwriting silence. I have watched this story unfold from behind countless masks, and I can tell UN power becomes abstract enough, it cannot be killed. And so, as the world stares at screens, trading pixels and chasing noise, the oldest truth remains: money is not real. The Rothschilds may never have printed money, but they helped build the machine that made the world need to, and that is the only empire that never ends.